necessarily true, because a treaty only is a legal instrument. And a treaty can be also signed when there is very low level of trust between countries, there's hardly any fairness in that treaty, even the benefits are not really shared equitably. And most important thing is that even if many of these things exist, without the capacity of the signing countries to implement what they have committed for in that treaty. And if you really look at the South Asian river basins, what we today see is that most of these treaties are locked in asymmetries, which I'm going to discuss with two examples, and has failed to evolve with time and with several uncertainties that we see, including climate uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty. Most of these treaties have ignored the ecological value and also, most importantly, local voices, people who actually live with risk realities. As a whole, what I try to argue is that treaties does not necessarily mean that there is a trust building or there is enhanced trust between the countries signing the treaty. So a treaty can stabilize relations on paper, while inequity and vulnerability can continue on the ground. And so what actually a diplomacy or real diplomacy should mean is that it should be something that provides or that makes countries, gives them the ability to negotiate power, uncertainty, risk, and fairness over time. Very quickly, I wanted to explain this with two examples of my own work that I've been doing on this river basin, which we call it as the Brahmaputra River Basin. As you can see on the screen, this is how the basin looks like, shared between China, India, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, and it is called by different names in each country. Most of the treaties or MOUs that you see for this river basins, these are bilateral in nature. So I take first India-Bangladesh case. There is something called Joint River Commission, which was established in 1972. Interestingly, India and Bangladesh shares 54 transboundary rivers. Because it is not possible to sign so many MOUs and so many agreements, so the idea of JRC was that having a commission will facilitate data exchange for all of these shared basins and also allow joint studies so that we can together look after the river basin for the benefit of the community and also for the benefit of the environment. However, the reality is something different because this has been there, more than 50 years. Cooperation has been very, very narrow and to a large extent reactive. When there is a need to talk, we only talk at the time, otherwise we are mostly silent. What we also see is that out of 54 rivers, there are only 8 major rivers where we share data. That also during monsoon period, we don't share lean season data. These data are only data in the form of water level discharge, not actionable information, which actually was kind of an impact when there was a flood, which probably many of you must have heard in 2024, which did not only had an impact on Bangladesh, but also in India. And one of the reasons was lack of monitoring station, lack of joint sharing of information, because of which the control of information basically also led to control of negotiation, in the sense that although Bangladesh has several times approached India for sharing more information and data, this was an opportune time for them to actually bargain this further. But it was so much politicized that it actually became a blame game rather than using this as an opportunity to have a better kind of understanding between the country. And as such, forecasting has become securitized and at the end citizens suffer. So what we actually see and what we argue is that JRC, which was an early promise, it actually has become a paper tiger, that it has a structure and institution exists, but doesn't bring any transformative cooperation. And this sharing of data is mostly a symbolic thing, but has not really led to trust building. So I bring the next case of China and India. I think most of you also know that China and India has a very interesting relationship with lots of ups and downs. However, in the river basin, which is Brahmaputra, where China is the upstream country, we do have a memorandum of understanding since 2002, but it now expired in 2023. We are waiting for it to get renewed. But this MOU is also for sharing hydrological data, and we do also have an expert level mechanism for technical dialogue. But I just want to very quickly show you this diagram, which basically shows you the interaction over the years between China and India in the dynamic geopolitical context, because India, China also have a lot of border issues, has been an ebb and flow kind of interaction. But we have never reached a payoff which is as high as what we received in 2006, which means that our relationship, despite having an opportunity of becoming better or improving further, has actually deteriorated, with today not really having an MOU to even share the hydrological data. So what you see here, and why, what is the problem? The problem is that these MOUs and ELM are mostly political signaling, and it's actually considered to be low cost and low risk. Rather than going and renegotiating everything, both countries feel that, maintaining what we have makes more sense, because China wants to retain leverage as upstream. India fears that asking too much transparency may, create another issue in terms of China may not agree. So it's more like a safe strategy. And so both countries felt that let's go ahead unilaterally. So there is a kind of a race for them. So status quo in the case of India, China, interestingly, is a rational choice and not really an accidental outcome. So if you go back to what I brought in terms of locked-in asymmetries, what you see in the case of both China and India and Bangladesh is that, because of this, power asymmetry with upstream and downstream relationship, this asymmetry has actually become institutionalized. So India cannot really verify whether construction of dam is happening, how much data is required, what kind of data required independently. So this also has become institutionalized. Similarly, in the case of Bangladesh, there is an informal information imbalance, which has led to institutional dependency. So what you see overall is that there is a structural inequality despite having formal mechanism in place. And what you also see is that ultimately cross-border community suffers and has resulted in something which we call it as negative peace, while there is no open conflict, but there is no transformative cooperation either. So I want to end by, bringing in this slide by saying that how do we move ahead? And one of the things that I have been arguing is that, so much of focus on track one diplomacy, where only government to government talks, is something that seems to have failed and has actually not led us through what we have seen today, that we are either in status quo or we are in a negative peace situation. What needs to be done is that we definitely need to bring in multi-track diplomacy. And this is so important because only single track cannot really understand the whole river. And diplomacy needs to become plural and rather being exclusive, which is what we see today. And what you also see is that so much of science has been generated, so much of their knowledge which is there, but they are not shared. So what you see that most of these track one diplomacy happens not so much on science, but more from a point of view of nationalistic claims. So with this, I will end my talk by this last line, that rivers negotiate every day, but it is time for our diplomacy to catch up with the river. Thank you.
Thank you, Anamika, for such interesting and thought-provoking reflections on pluralizing water diplomacy. With that note, I would like to invite Yasir and Muhammad to share his stories. In the meantime, please share your questions in the chat for Anamika. After Yasir's presentation, we will take up your questions.
I'm trying to share my screen. Do you see it now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Shanur and your team for this opportunity to talk about, what's happening in the Nile. In fact, when you asked me at the first time, I didn't know what I'm going to talk about. But last week, I looked into the announcement of this episode, and I read one statement mentioning that when power asymmetries are present, water can be used as a tool for oppression. So I thought, what could be the links between the Nile water politics and Sudan's ongoing war now? Is there any connection? And I'm trying to test this hypothesis. As you know, since April 2023, there is ongoing war in Sudan between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces, the paramilitia forces. And this war is classified now as the largest humanitarian crisis in the world because there is about 13 million internally displaced people, 2 million refugees, and maybe more than 150,000 people have been killed. A lot of destructions in the country. And even last week, there was almost like ethnic cleansing in Al-Fashir city in Darfur. So the hypothesis which I'm trying to test is that there is no link between the current instability in Sudan and the Nile water politics. So what I'm trying to do is to reject this hypothesis and to see if there is any connection between the ongoing war in Sudan and the politics in the Nile, specifically on the GERD issue, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and which means Ethiopia and Egypt. But maybe before discussing that, it is important to see the context of the Eastern Nile or the Blue Nile. And what you see here, the GERD is a very huge dam. The three countries really depends on the Nile, or in this case, the Blue Nile. For Ethiopia, it is a huge source for hydropower because it's very important for their ambitious development plan. It will almost double the hydropower, the electricity in Ethiopia. For Sudan, it is also very important because more than 70% of the Sudanese people depends on agriculture. Major part of it is irrigated agriculture, which also depends on the Nile. For Egypt, I mean, you all know that this famous notion is that if there is no Nile, there is no Egypt. More than 95% of the water resources of Egypt comes from the Nile. And what you see here in these graphs, that the countries also, they have huge population and high population growth rate. Ethiopia is almost like 120 or 30, Egypt 105 or 10, Sudan almost 50. And as I said, the majority of this population, more than 60-70%, depends on agriculture. The GDP is also shows that Ethiopia and Sudan are really as a poor countries with $1,000 per capita GDP. Egypt is much better, 4 times better. What you can also see from this map is that the Nile and the Red Sea are somehow connected geographically. The Red Sea is politically very important path because major part of the global trade pass through the Red Sea. Also, Horn of Africa and also the Middle East issue are somehow connected to the Nile. Now, the hydropolitics of the Nile, maybe some of you hear that always Egypt, they say that any threat on the Nile is existential threat for them. And they say the Nile water is untouchable, which is a kind of form of hydrohegemony. On the other side, you see from Ethiopia, this is an interview by Al Jazeera channel, like 4 or 5 years ago, where Dina Mufti, the spokesperson of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia, he answered the question, is Ethiopia thinking of selling Nile water to downstream? His answer was, why not? Everything is possible. So this is triggered a lot of mistrust and tension on what would happen upstream and what would be the implication downstreams. While if you see the notion of Egypt is that the Nile water is untouchable because they depend on the Nile, it's also extreme because upstream countries, they also have intention for development. So somehow, as if you are seeing that the hydro hegemony is one time from the downstream end, another time from the upstream end. This is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, has been completed and inaugurated in September this year. It was a big event. And what you see in this diagram, there is a Sudanese dam called Roseris Dam immediately downstream. And there is the High Aswan Dam in Egypt. It's like 2,000 kilometers downstream. So the three countries, they have different position. Of course, depends on their interest. Ethiopia is the dam owner. For them, the hydropower generation of the GERD will double the electricity in the country. Sudan position is that there is a lot of expected benefit from the GERD, provided that there is an agreement on information exchange or coordination. And why is that? Because of the proximity of this small dam immediately downstream the GERD. For Egypt, the High Aswan Dam can absorb any hydrological shocks, I mean, filling of the GERD or drought, because it is too big. It is 2 times bigger than, or even more than the GERD. But since 2011, the start of construction of the GERD, there is no agreement, despite 10 times or 10 rounds of negotiations. And why is that? What's the reasons? It seems that for Ethiopia, the cost of no agreement is very low. Not to commit on any legally binding agreement which might affect their hydropower generation. That is their position. For Egypt, they have the High Aswan Dam. The GERD is hydropower dam, so it's not consuming water. So any new agreement which change the position of the status quo may not be very attractive for them. What remains, Sudan in between, is very keen to reach an agreement because of the safety of Roseris Dam, and also to be able to benefit from the regulated flow. Because if there is no kind of regulated flow, it will be very difficult not only to safeguard the Roseris, but also to make use of the water. And here I must say there was a transition and arrangement document signed in October 2022 between Ethiopia and Sudan for data exchange between the GERD and Roseris. But this document is not announced, neither by Ethiopia nor by Sudan. And we just saw it, I mean, in the social media, in the internet, I mean, 3-4 pages defined technically how would be the data exchange, information exchange, but it's not like a legal document. I mean, it's not binding. It has no dispute resolution mechanism. Now, coming back to the main hypothesis is that this ongoing war, is there any links to the Nile politics? What you can see in the top photo is that this is the army leader of Sudan. The first visit he made is to Egypt, while there is a lot of reports that Egypt supports Sudan in this war, politically. And what you see, the bottom photo is that this is the militia leader. The first visit he made when the war started is to Ethiopia. And there are also reports that there is supporters of the RSF, they are already in Ethiopia. But it's also linked to the regional politics. I mean, the regional powers in the region, like United Arab Emirates and other countries, even in Middle East, but also the global powers. Now, of course, the war is not about the Nile water issues. I mean, the war started in Sudan in April 2023. It's not about the Nile water. But there is substantial links to the Nile politics, specifically on Egypt and Ethiopia. And that's related to the GERD. Sudan position in the middle, geographically in the middle, is very important because if it aligns with Egypt, it will be seen against Ethiopia. If it aligns with Ethiopia, it will be seen against Egypt. And as I mentioned, there is a lot of reports that Egypt supports Sudan in this war, at least politically. And there is also a lot of reports that Ethiopia welcoming RSF. The complexity is that there is no agreement yet. There is this transitional arrangement, but it is even not announced. I mean, we never heard Ethiopia or Sudan, they said, okay, we signed a kind of transition agreement. And because of this ongoing war, you see more kind of alignment of Sudan and Egypt, because as a direct result of the war, on the GERD issue, early September, there was what they call it, quartet meeting in Egypt, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Water from Sudan and Egypt. They had a press release and they announced that they are against these unilateral actions by Ethiopia on the GERD. So here it is important to say that the Sudan independent role, which used to be very strong in the past, on the negotiation has been very much affected by the war. I mean, we have seen Sudan active role in 2013 in the international panel of experts. Sudan played a very important role in reaching consensus. Even declaration of principles signed in 2015 in Khartoum, also direct result of Sudan critical role in reaching consensus. In June 2020, we also almost reaching an agreement on the GERD, 90% of the issues resolved, also because of the role of Sudan. And that is only because of the geographical position of Sudan being in the middle. So my final remark is that while the war in Sudan is not caused by the Nile water question, it has been influenced by the position on the Nile. And as I said, the clear alliances of Sudan and Egypt on the GERD issue. I must also mention that weakening of global and regional institutions, I mean like African Union, Arab League, even the Security Council, amplified this pursuit of unilateral national interest, often at the expense of adherence to international law. And it's very clear that the geopolitical interest in the Nile, but also in the Red Sea, are strongly shaping the position on the GERD. Sudan's position on the Nile politics is very important. And I must say that if this instability or if this war in Sudan continues for more years to come, there is high risk it can spill over to neighboring countries because of the strong interlinkages at the border between tribes and so on. But I must also say that the future stability in our region depends on building mutual interdependencies, because the GERD is a hydropower dam, it's not consuming water, it's for generating electricity. And the philosophy, when it started in 2011, it will bring benefits to the three countries, to Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. And there is still the opportunities if this philosophy is retained back, not only on water, but to think more on the like of the political economy of the three countries, like for example, food security, energy security, water security, trades, access to the sea. All these are bring benefit to the people of the three countries. And there is examples of transboundary water treaties in many river basins, in several river basins, which overcome very critical political tensions. I mean, India, Pakistan is a clear example, Mauritania, Senegal on the border disputes. there was transboundary agreements and withstand all these kind of tension and political tensions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yasir. As we mentioned at the beginning of our episode, we also acknowledge the atrocities, the ongoing oppression that is happening in Sudan, in Palestine, and many other regions across the world as we speak. I would like to invite the audience now to share their questions. You can switch on your video if you wish to, and while raising your hands for asking question to Yasir and Anamika. Yes, Ose.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much for the nice presentations. I just wanted to highlight from, water cycle perspective, the issue of the atmospheric moisture flows, and that we often, as hydrologists or so, talk about river basins, but that there is also very much important water flows going on in the atmosphere. And it has been established that the Congo, the rainforest in the Congo is contributing with a lot of, atmospheric moisture that travels to Sudan and actually rains down as rainfall, and that the impact of deforestation also has an impact on this rainfall. And even though Congo is not part of any river basin commission, in effect, the actions taking place in Congo does have an impact on the water resources in the river basin. So I was just wondering if this is on your radar, and if this is anything that could be relevant for your discussions in the future. Thank you so much for your attention.
Yasir, would you like to respond?
Yes, I mean, it's fortunately I did a lot of work on moisture recycling, but long time ago. I mean, what we did in those days, we tried to test the Sud wetlands. If you know the Sud wetlands, it's huge wetlands in South Sudan, and it is as big as the area of the Netherlands. So what we did two climate scenarios. Is that if we took out the wetlands and if we keep the wetlands, what will happen to the rainfall? And we built the regional climate model in those days, and we tested the scenarios, and we found that the moisture coming from the ocean is much bigger compared to the moisture generated from the wetlands. So the wetlands will affect the microclimate. I mean, the temperature will increase, the humidity will decrease, but the rainfall, we found it very little impact. But I agree with you, there is a lot of research ongoing now in many areas of the world, pointing out to what is the source of river waters. It might be also from other countries, but this area is it needs a lot of research, I hope, in the coming years, because bringing this to the political debate in transboundary context, it will make it even more complex.
Thank you, Yasir. We have two questions for Anamika. Due to each time limitations, I'll pick the last question. Perhaps Anamika, you can engage with Salika in the chat. The question that we're going to forward to Anamika is, how do you envision the insights from track 1.5, 2, and 3 being systematically fed into the official track 1 negotiations, especially in the case of Brahmaputra and Ganges basins?
Thank you for the questions. One of the things that is important to understand is that the acceptance that we need to move beyond track 1. I'm talking about in the case of South Asia. I think even now there is this understanding that when you talk about diplomacy, it is mostly government to government interaction. But over the years, what we have also seen that what exactly is track 2, for example? It's even two academicians working together from India and China, India and Bangladesh, developing science together, feeding into negotiation is actually another form of diplomacy. So I think there is a lot of possibility. It's not that it's not, of course, that space is kind of unfortunately becoming smaller and smaller in the present kind of regime that we are seeing probably across the world, including India. So I think what is important here is that we should not stop ourselves by just expecting governments, coming together and providing us with a solution, which is, for example, transboundary disasters, because disasters is something which bring countries and people together. So I do see that it takes time. Diplomacy takes time, talking to each other takes time, dialogues takes time, but it has to go on. And I think it has already worked a lot in several track one negotiation, where many of our research has found place while negotiation is happening. And just one last point, Shannon, I would not say that India-China negotiation or diplomacy is beyond imagination at present. There is always a window of opportunity, and we must keep looking at that window of opportunity. And that is why since 2002 to 2023, we always had an MOU. But what is important is building trust among the South Asian countries. I think that is still at a bare minimum. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasir and Anamika. With this end of part one of our storytelling session, I would like to invite my cohorts from South Caucasus Water Academics Network, Dawe van der Meer, to co-moderate the part two of our storytelling session of episode 7.
Yes, thank you very much, Shahnur. Happy to take over here. And I would like to invite our next speaker to tell her story. Next speaker is Lamis Kdemat. She's a Palestinian water professional specializing in water and environmental human rights, currently pursuing a PhD at Newcastle University and based in the School of Geography, Politics, and Sociology. Lamis holds 2 master degrees in the field, one from Al-Quds University in Palestine and one from the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education in the Netherlands. So Lamis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dawi. Can you hear me very well? Yes? Yeah. And thank you, Shahnur. Before moving to my story, as Shahnur started, I would like to acknowledge the atrocities and the genocides in Gaza and in Palestine, as well as in Sudan, that we are facing currently. That's the first part. And the second part, I would like to tell a true ongoing story of the water diplomacy and how the water diplomacy is functional or not functional in a prolonged occupation, as the case study of Palestine. And my personal story, how I engaged with that. So first of all, after I had my master's from the IHE Delft, it was mainly about water governance and management, and I specialized in water diplomacy and conflict. So from that time, I had this challenge in my mind that the way of education within IHE really challenged me to try the real life diplomacy when I go back to Palestine. So that's why I decided to search for kind of organizations that relates water and diplomacy. And I found one organization, the name is EcoPeace Middle East. So I was working with EcoPeace Middle East before I came here to the UK since the past 2 years, though the experience is really challenging. And I can say, like, in very short, these kind of organizations that working either in water or any other issues in Palestine or in another prolonged conflict or occupation is basically to maintain the status quo of the marginalized country, which is in my case study is Palestine. So the system and what I was working with EcoPeace, we talk, for me, I was responsible of the approach of bottom up, if anyone familiar with that. So I was basically focusing on educating the young professionals about water and environmental diplomacy trainings and workshops. So basically, if we can mention the theme and the training itself, it is always based in the security peace framework, and this was one of my main concerns, that though in Palestine we have a lot of challenge, for example, like one of our main challenges about transboundary water over the Jordan River, and after Oslo agreement, the Palestinians have zero amount of the water from the Jordan River. However, though, the kind of diplomacy that we educate the young professionals about the future possibilities and the future aims of how we can negotiate over the Jordan River for us as Palestinians to have more shared water resources. So that's the nice and the basic outsider goal, which is anyone involved in the diplomacy see this as like the most fairness thing that the Palestinians can have, especially in these current days. However, employing and teaching the young professionals this kind of a framework, shifting the mindsets, not only with the Palestinians, with the other participants of the training, shifting the mindsets of us, not focusing on why the Palestinians currently having a zero share of this Jordan River. Why we end up as Palestinians having no amount of this. What was the original story? What was the historical background about that? So the framework, how this organization or other related organization, how they work, they shift us of thinking about the core causes of the problem and who have the right first. And it's exactly the same also situation with the Nile River, and shifting this mindsets to think about that this is what we already have and what we can do for the future. So this kind of shifting of the mindsets with the younger professionals. So for example, I give a training for over more than 300 young Palestinian professionals in the field. And imagine the amount of information and the amount of mindsets shifts of us as Palestinians stopped talking of the water as our right and start talking the water as something we may aim to have an equal or equitable shared of it in the future, and that's a result of maybe having a very long-term negotiation with the Israelis, as well as also in the table now we have the Jordanians. So that was one of my obstacles, how I can deal with that, as I was the responsible of giving this kind of training. And the other important thing for these normalized organizations working within Palestine, Israel, as well as in Jordan, because if we are talking about shared water resources, especially about the Jordan River, Jordan is always involved. Though, however, there is also like a lot of binational trainings happens with the Palestinians and Israelis, but never talked also about the groundwater, which is one of the major resources in Palestine. It's the groundwater resources that is 58% of it controlled by Israel, and the Palestinian Authority have to purchase this water from the Israeli company, which is called Mikarot. So the main major issue also about the water in Palestine, it's the groundwater, and it was never discussed as as a training material within the water diplomacy trainings, which was for me as also, like as I said, and again, like shifting the mindsets of focusing on one main thing and not really focusing on solving the problem. That's why there is a lot of researchers nowadays and a lot of scholars trying to writing a new framework of the water diplomacy, especially in the Middle East, and shifting the water diplomacy framework from working only on security peace to equity and identity. So that's shifting in this framework can even have benefits of the people and the indigenous people, the indigenous Palestinians living in that area. They already have the right of their own water resources. Israel took over this right, and the diplomacy have to be around this idea and have to be around this historical water right that the Palestinian lost because of the Israeli domination and because of Israel's uses the hydrohegemony, also another concept, the hydrohegemony framework to control and to domain all the water resources. And to back up also like my analysis, which is, I believe, Dr. Yasser, what he said, everything going on Sudan is related to the water. It is also like for us, since the beginning of not even establishing the Israeli state in 1948, it was even before when the British Empire was here in Palestine from the 1970s. The main aim is to control as much as they can of the resources, water resources and land, and this is how they can dominate and control the people and the society. And as a result, when the Israelis came in, when the official Israeli state established in 1948, directly after 4 years, there was the major water carrier project was implemented by Israel. So basically, to carry out the prolonged occupation of Israel since 48 until this moment, it was always carried and backed up with as much as controlling and managing the water resources in the region. So that's how they manage the Palestinian lives and communities. And that's never end until we saw the weaponization in Gaza in the past few years. Before that, when they established the apartheid wall, which we call it the apartheid wall, the separation wall between the West Bank and Israel, and which I call it the water barrier, because they changed the plan where they will establish the wall to gather as much as they can from the water resources, water springs inside the Palestinian land. So they took over most of the water springs in the border. So this continuation of the control from the Israeli side is reminding us again and again that water diplomacy in a prolonged colonization and prolonged occupation, especially the Palestinian case, and I refer for the Palestinian case, is not a practical solution, because in Palestine, and if we look as for Gaza example, in Palestine, we have more things to do as a community with our governments and to look after each other first. And then maybe in the future, a framework, when it is shifted from security peace to equity and identity, maybe there is a space to talk about it and to talk about the future diplomacy that can solve the real problem of water. Other than that, what we believe and how we analyze the water situation in Palestine, that diplomacy is not a valid solution and it will not be a valid solution. And that's my understanding so far. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lamis, for this powerful story. And now for the last, speaker, we'll move on to Farhad Mukhtarov, who we've given the role of a rapper. So he's kind of like wrapping up. But if you still have any questions for Lamis or for the other speakers, please feel free to put them in the chat. So introducing Farhad. Farhad Mukhtarov is an assistant professor of Governance and Public Policy at the International Institute of Social Sciences, which is part of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Dr. Mukhtarov is a social scientist with a profile at the intersection of water policy and development studies. He works on water governance, policy translation, and discourse analysis. And besides this, he's also the co-founder of the South Caucasus Water Academic Network, which is one of the organizers of this discussion. So over to you, Farhad. Feel free to reflect on anything mentioned in the previous discussion and also your own work and experience with water diplomacy.
Thanks very much, Dawa and Shahnur, and of course the speakers, Professor Bara, Professor Mohammed, and Ms. Gdemat. Yeah, a lot of rich material. Special compliments to the last speaker for not using the slides, but being very clear and very powerful. So there is a lot of, as you said, there's a lot of things going wrong at the moment, and there are a lot of atrocities, but this panel gives me hope because we're talking and we're making sense and we're looking for solutions. So thanks for this inspiration. The talks of Professor Bara and Professor Mohammed were very different from each other. If Professor Bara emphasized going beyond the states, so multi-track diplomacy and not just leaving it in the hands of the states, and also suggested the movement away from water or modern water to rivers and the agency of rivers, even rivers as diplomats. The talk of Professor Mohammed was very, very interesting and informative, but very much based on the states, and very much based in high politics. So not just water, but the regional power relationships, the geopolitics, the ongoing war, who is supporting whom. So both perspectives are important, but they are quite different. What is interesting is that both talks actually ended with the same message, and the message was that we need to foster mutual interdependencies between the riparians. So that's interesting. Even though you come from very different sides, you end up in the same point that we depend on each other and we have to work together and we have to build those relationships, which in my view is an point in favor of all kind of diplomacies in order to create those links and in order to create trust. So I first kind of will discuss these two talks and then I will finish with Ms. Gdemat's presentation. So what was interesting to me is that there are two ongoing debates in the field of water governance / water diplomacy, because I believe these two fields are really related. You cannot talk about diplomacy without talking about management. One debate is water and war. Do countries fight over water? Do communities fight over water? Or is it more complex than that? And I think all three speakers spoke about this. It's interesting because in the 90s, there was this paper by Aaron Wolf in 98, basically saying that there is more cooperation than conflict. And the thesis on water war is just over-bloated, and the empirics doesn't really support that thesis. And now there is research by Peter Glegg, another giant of water management, saying that, look, the conflicts are going up, and actually water is playing a role here. So it seems that this debate is coming back, and I think it's good to talk about it. So in that sense, what you've been doing, Professor Mohammed, bringing in high politics, other modern water kind of issues is important, but it complicates things. Well, reality is complicated, but it's interesting to observe that this debate is coming back, and also your talk, Lami, is very much about the hard power of occupation and the importance of water in making sure that the oppressed remains oppressed. And the second debate is, of course, the debate that Jamie Linton started in 2010 with his book What is Water, is that, you know, we've been talking about water as this abstract, transparent substance in a glass, and water management as something that is objective and done by technocrats, but there are actually rivers which are embedded, which have their cultural ecosystem and other importance in a particular space, very much context dependent. And that movement away from modern river water towards embedded rivers is very much what is now being debated also in the literature, which is called hydrofeminism, right? The literature on treating water as something that is not just a resource, it's very much part of our daily lives, something that we drink, we live, we're required to exist, but also which brings meaning to our lives. The question that came was very interesting about atmospheric rivers. I think that question basically raises another big point, is what is a river, or what is a river basin? You know, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot of debate between hydrologists, hydromorphologists, political scientists. What is a river basin? How do you draw those boundaries? Now you're complicating that even further by bringing in the atmospheric rivers, and it may be a productive debate, but it's also a frame. So I think it's good to realize that that frame also leaves other things outside, and other things is that idea of embeddedness. The more you talk about the atmospheric rivers and the hydrocycle, the less you're inclined to speak about the very much embedded riparians, the importance of the border communities, the importance of river as something that is part of the daily lives of communities. Yeah, it's just a different frame. Both are important, but it's good to realize that framing matters. And with that, I want to come to Ms. Klemat's wonderful talk, very powerful. And the talk is, if I'm forced, like if you put gun to my head and you say, summarize this talk in 2 words, I would say not only hard power, but also soft power. So you have been talking that, look, there is hard power going on. Of course, occupation. Of course, Egypt has been controlling the Nile Basin for a long time. China is very much powerful in the Mekong River Basin, and as we learned also in the other rivers. But there is also a lot of soft power going on, including those trainings where you've been part of. And that's, of course, linked to the funding, because those initiatives mostly funded by international donors, Western donors. And if I think about the country like the Netherlands, which in my experience only has good intentions, and there is no bad intentions involved in helping the world peace and making sure that countries reach agreements and so on, is also involved in promoting frames which are actually a movement away from human rights. So if you look at, for example, the reports of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which is co-hosted, co-convened by the government of the Netherlands. If you look at the reports of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is also supported by many Dutch and other governments and experts, we've done some work on content analysis of those reports, and you see that the phrases of human rights, equity, things like equality, justice, the things that you've been mentioning, Lamis, they don't appear. It's a different frame. It's a frame of efficiency, transparency. It's a frame of financialization, investment. So I think it's important to realize that we live in a world where ideas, ideologies, discourses are not neutral, and funding comes with strings attached. But that said, we still have agency on the ground. So what you've been doing, standing there in front of 300 Palestinian young professionals and inserting the human rights frame as opposed to the security frame, is very important to continue doing. So we do have agency, and we can challenge those big hegemonic discourses also within our spaces. So with that, I think I will stop wrapping up, and I'm sorry that the speed of my talk was just like in the rap, but I had to do it to make sure that I fit in 10 minutes. Thanks very much for your talks and for the privilege of having a chance to discuss.
Thank you very much for this reflection, Farhad. I think you should consider a rapping career. Excuse me for the pun. I'd also like to give the opportunity still for the other speakers to maybe reflect on Farhad's reflections. So Lamis, Yassir, Anamika, if you have any thoughts or comments on this, please feel free to jump in. And Lamis, there's also a question for you in the chat. Since for time limitations, I would like to ask you to also answer to that in the chat because of time. So does any of you have any reflections of this? Any from the other speakers?
Not sure if we have time, but
I think we can go on
maybe
for a couple minutes. Yeah.
just a very quick point to Farhad. It is complicit, the Netherlands and any other international organization or donors in doing this kind of funding of these projects. For in the Middle East, Netherlands is there, Canada is there, SIDA from Sweden, as well as USAID after Trump he came, the money came again. So I don't believe in a good intention. It is a continuation of what is going on the ground. So that's just to confirm. I lived in Palestine and I worked before this, also another few years on another international organization. Mostly there is a condition. If we work here, if we fund a Palestinian small farmer project, we have to fund also another key pots, like Israeli agricultural settlements also there and so on. So that's also a continuation of the status quo of whatever is there in Palestine to stay as it is, and funding smaller projects, helping small communities here and there. So the situation remains more or less stable in how they say it. You see, that's more political view, but it is on the ground. So it's not a very professional conclusion from my side, but where is water diplomacy in Palestine? That's even, it's not something that even we can think about. And yeah, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Lamis. And Anamika, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I thought maybe we are running out of time, so I didn't like to come in. But anyway, so thank you so much, Farhad, for concluding it so nicely. Just wanted to add one thing. I think when we talk about state and non-state actors in water diplomacy, I would say that while state actors are definitely important, I mean, when in my presentation, what I basically tried to bring out is that if there is no willingness from the state, even if non-state actors keep, asking for cooperative arrangement or trust building, it probably would not happen. But what I feel very strongly is that while state would do its work, the non-state actors can actually create an enabling environment for the states to come together and work together. And that actually has helped, particularly in the case of India, Bangladesh, and the Ganges negotiation that is happening. A lot of work that academicians have brought in has actually been used in terms of how do we arrive at lean water flow understanding, which we could never agree on in the last 30 years when the treaty was there. So in nutshell, what I'm trying to say that diplomacy has to be definitely something which should not just stick to one track, but if it is multi-track, although non-state and non-governmental, it really helps in creating a political environment where politicians sometimes feel that we need to do it to also save our votes, So that's something that I just wanted to add. And thanks again.
Thank you, Anamika. And I'd like to give the final word to Yassir. If you have any comments or final thoughts, feel free to share them.
Yes, thank you so much. Very briefly, because of time constraints and the comment of Farhad about water and wars. I mean, we all understand that water is not the reason of the war, for example, this one in Sudan. But we also understand that the complex interaction of this war and the water of the Nile, for example. And I have shown these alliances of Sudan with Egypt. Of course, immediately it comes on the GERD issue. And I also like your comment is that despite this interdependencies open the doors for cooperation. And here I must reflect again this Indus Treaty. I mean, with the stand 2-3 wars between India and Pakistan. So again, on the 9 issues, I mean, you need this kind of agreements because it's very much paves the way for development. But at the same time, political tensions can be there. I mean, that's maybe one day in the future, countries can come to cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yassir. And with that, I'd like to end this episode with a final thank you to all the speakers, Annemieke Barua, Yassir Mohammed, Lamis Klimat, and Farhad Mukhtarov. Thank you very much for this insightful discussion. For next episodes, please make sure to follow Shahnur on LinkedIn. I believe that's the safest way of making sure that you get any updates. And with that, I'd like to end here and wish you all a very nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you to our audience. See you in the next episode.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. What do you think?